What is up, everybody? I have had many people ask me over the years, how do I get into PvP? How do I even know where to start? So for a while now, I've been wanting to make a all-encompassing guide to how to PvP. So this is going to be part one of a many-part series explaining every step of how to get started to get into PvP. Today, we are going to be going over all of the symbols that will be on your cards in the arena. There is a lot to go over, so we're going to start things simple. We're going to get into the really nitty-gritty stuff, and then we'll bring it back and talk about some of the slang that's used in PvP. So that way, when you're watching somebody like me or many of the other content creators that do PvP, you'll be able to understand what they're saying, because sometimes they use terms that aren't really in the game. If you feel like you already understand this game pretty well, there might actually be some things that surprise you on this list, or at least some things that you might find entertaining that King's Isle has kind of looked over and done weird over the years. So let's hop into it. So for those of you who don't know, there's actually a fairly helpful tab in our spell book that helps us find all of the information on the spell cards to an extent. If you go to your spellbook here and you click on this icon dictionary button, it's this little question mark down by where you change your arch mastery and equip your deck and go to quick sell treasure cards. This little dictionary has a lot of different things about all sorts of things in this game, but what we are importantly going to be looking at is things that appear on cards. So let's start with the basics here. The damage symbol right down here is on so many cards in the game. This is any damaging spell or any card that buffs or debuffs damaging spells. You will see this everywhere. I'm sure you already know what this is, but like I said, we're starting basic. It's normally accompanied by a school's damage type and is pretty self-explanatory. Now, the heal icon is again very self-explanatory. It shows up on heals that just simply heal you immediately. 400 healing, very simple. For deaths, you might recognize this broken heart symbol. It is for drains. It is for things that heal you for usually, not always, half of the HP of the damage of which you deal. Moving on to this next page, there is a lot of information here, so we're going to break down just the important ones, because the way they've ordered this list doesn't always refer to things that are actually on cards. So starting with the top of the list, global. Now, nobody calls globals globals. The colloquial term that we use as players is called bubble. Now, what bubble/globals actually do is provide an effect to every single entity on the battlefield. The most common instance of this is school-specific damage bubbles. I will often pack at least 4 of these to buff my balanced school hits. The major thing to note about these spells is when somebody else casts a different one for their school, or maybe one that gives a different effect, it will replace the previous one. So don't expect these to stick around, but they are a very important piece of PvP. So much so that the developers actually restricted the amount of copies of these that you can have to only 4 per type of bubble. Now, moving down the list, once again, we have a couple other things that we don't typically use these words to refer to them. So this clover shape is charm, but what that actually means to most players is blades. Blades are simply buffs that you put on yourself to increase your damage output. Normally they increase the damage by a percentage, but sometimes they'll add pierce and sometimes they'll do other weird things, but primarily we're just referring to regular old blades. Naturally, the reverse of this is called a curse, but we never call it that. We either call them weaknesses, to refer to the balanced spell weakness that debuffs an incoming hit, or infections that are used to decrease the amount of heals your opponents can do. Moving on to the next symbol, we have ward, which people refer to as shields. Again, it is primarily just shields. There are technically absorbs, but those are not really used in PvP. Maybe one day we will see the return of absorbs, but this symbol is pretty much just for shields. Moving on to the next one, the reverse of a shield is a trap, but on this list it is labeled as a jinx. I've never once heard anybody refer to a trap as a jinx. Technically, I don't even know what you would even use. This is swap jinx. I've always called this a swap trap. Even an infection trap, we would just call an infection trap, not a heal jinx. So nobody ever calls them jinxes. These are traps. I'm just realizing most of the community calls curses negative charms, not curses. Especially considering there's a spell called curse that's a trap and I've never heard it called a jinx. Man, KingsIsle has bad names for their things. Skipping ahead a little bit, we have the minion icon. That just simply means you are going to summon a minion with that spell that will fight alongside you. Currently, the only spell in PvP that summons a minion is the Myth Shadow Hit spell, but I'm really hoping that they bring more minions back, so that's why I'm referring to them now. Now, something that's not really on the spell list is chromatic and random elements of spells. This symbol up top here, the random, just means it's going to do a random school's damage. There's not many cards that have the random mechanic on it, but it's here, so it's important to talk about. Now, what chromatic means is it takes the school identity of either the caster or the opponent, depending on the spell. This spell specifically does 630 damage of your opponent's school, and then has another effect. A more simple spell like Catch of the Day is a hit and then gives you a 45% blade of your specific school. I will note with blades, weaknesses, traps, and shields, if you try to use a chromatic thing against a balance or as a balance, they are actually universal of those things, not school specific, and they are actually weaker. It's just one of those weird things surrounding the chromatic mechanic that I don't really understand why it exists, but I guess balance is special. The other mechanic you might see on cards is gaining pips. If you ever see this little white pip symbol, it means you're going to gain 3 white pips. Pretty self-explanatory on this card, but it gets a little complicated with some of the newer spells. If we take a look at a spell like Power Nova that can potentially give us up to 6 pips, it actually doesn't give us 6 white pips. It will give us the responding amount of power pips and white pips to add up to a total of 6. So at max value, it would be 3 power pips. And then if it were, say, 3 shields that would activate this spell, it would give us 1 power pip and 1 noob pip. And then if you ever see this pip with the white around it, that's a power pip. So that one's a little easier to understand. Now here's where the video starts to get a little complicated and a little weird. So y'all need to bear with me just a little bit. So these 2 symbols here refer to overtime spells. The green one is a heal over time that you will get over multiple rounds. And this fist with the red circle around it is a damage over time that will deal damage to your opponent over several rounds. But KingsIsle has referred to these damage over time spells, aka dots, in many, many different ways. So I'm just going to go over them to show how ridiculous this is that KingsIsle notates these in such a weird, different way every single time. So I'm fairly certain this is the original notation for what all the old dots were. It is just a hit plus another increment of damage over 3 rounds. It spells it out. So it's very clear what the spell does. But then over time, that rounds was replaced with an icon that just means rounds. As you can see here with Path A Elf, it is notated very similarly. It is a damage plus another damage over 3, and now it's got this timer symbol that means rounds. But if we look down here at the bottom path, there's also things that say just damage dot 3 rounds. It doesn't have this over text on it, but this effectively just means 150 damage over time over 3 rounds. Things start to be notated a little less, a little more shorthand when they have a lot more text on the card. And then at some point we get to this, where there's a random number in the middle and a number in parentheses, and you might notice that the timer has disappeared. This spell actually reads 950 damage over time split amongst 2 different dots, and then the parentheses 5 means over 5 rounds. Now, I understand that sometimes we need to reduce the notation because spells have gotten really complicated, but look at how simple this spell is. They could have made it a little more obvious, but I can't even say this is the most recent notation because this is not a spell that came out a couple years ago. It's been like 3 or 4, I want to say. But pretty much all the rules I listed also apply to heal overtimes. The heals are noted this way with things like Pigsy. It is 125 heal right up front. That's where that original heal symbol comes from. And then it is 910 healing split amongst 2 heal overtimes over 4 rounds. As you play the game, these things become natural to you. You don't even notice that the notation on these cards are super weird. And we haven't even gotten to every single symbol on this card yet. There is one more type of dot I would like to talk about, and that is bomb overtimes. Now, in the icon dictionary, for some reason, deferred damage is listed well before damage overtimes, but they function very similarly because they can be removed with the same things that remove dots. Now, what a bomb overtime does, or a deferred damage overtime, we call them bomb overtimes. Or if we're feeling really spicy, a deferred hit. But nobody says deferred damage. I don't understand why they have all these terrible terms that nobody uses. But basically what these overtimes do is oftentimes they will have an initial hit, but not always. But effectively, any of the damage on the overtime doesn't actually do any damage till the last round of the overtime. So this spell reads 55 damage immediately, and then 640 damage on an overtime that deals all of its damage on the 5th round. Notably, unlike regular dots that do damage every round, this will not break shields every round that it is on. I believe this was KingsIsle's way to make dots less of an anti-shield thing and more of their own unique identity, but most of the time bomb overtimes are not very good because if they are removed, they've lost all effectiveness. That is all for the dots, but I just want to quickly add things that look similar to dots but are not quite the same because they don't say over time. Path A Minotaur shows 40 damage and 480. Sometimes dots are worded like that, but since it has that hit symbol and it doesn't have the dot symbol, it's just a double hit. And then some spells even hit 3 times and they're notated like this, where they just have the damage and the 3 types of damage that it does, and then the damage symbol. There are literally so many ways that they have notated damage over time or multiple instances of damage spells. It is just kind of ridiculous. All right, now we are going to get into all of the keywords that were added in just the last couple of years. I know we briefly touched on bomb overtimes, but those are kind of related to overtimes, so that was easy to explain for the most part. But the rest of these symbols are really strange and have kind of shaped the game in a weird way that some people are not a huge fan of, but I personally like the way they were going. I feel like spells used to be very simple. They were usually just a hit that had an after effect, and the way that this game has been shaped for these new things is for the better, in my opinion. Now, the first major change I want to talk about is for AOE spells. Now, in a 1v1 format where minions have been practically removed, AOEs are not that important, but again, I'm really hoping those AOEs come back, so I just want to briefly touch on the new way KingsIsle is doing area of effects. So spells now have this selective target mechanic where it has this little target icon. It's really small, and it's always paired with either this little devil symbol or this little smiley face. Now, if you ever see the devil on any card, it means enemy. Sometimes you'll see multiple of them. It's just referring to an AOE, but none of those are in PvP anymore. So whenever you see this, it means you can select multiple enemies. And whenever you see a smiley face on the card, that refers to allies. So this specific spell could be split amongst allies. Now, I'm saying the word split, but it is not that simple. Damage and heals are not simply split down the middle based on the amount of targets they have. This is kind of like a regressional system where it does less when you target multiple things, but it doesn't do half or quarter or third or anything like that. Now, the exact percent reduction per target is unclear to me. I tested Sandstorm with 0 damage, and what I kind of came up with is that when it's split amongst 2 targets, the percentage is times 0.764. So roughly 25% less effective. Split amongst 3 enemies is 0.584%. So a little more than 40% less effective. So about 52% less effective. So I don't know if that's consistent across all splits, but essentially it is not just splitting damage in half like a sandworm or any of the other Mirage Shads, where you choose how many targets you want to split it up to and it just splits it in half. Selective target is a little different. I hope you guys are staying with me because it's only going to get more complicated from here. So going back to our list here, we have auras and harmful auras. These symbols don't often appear in the card's description, but these symbols always appear in the little box window thing on the side of the card that I always pay zero attention to. Effectively, what regular auras do is they just buff your damage or buff your resist. It is a thing that you place on yourself that typically lasts 4 rounds to just give you a bit of an edge for those 4 rounds. And then negative auras with this dark symbol on them, you place on your opponent to give them some sort of hindrance, make them take more damage or make them deal less damage or make them heal less. Typically, the community just refers to these as positive auras and negative auras. And the reason why is because they actually cover each other up. What you'll often see is people running a bunch of these negative auras, so that way you're not allowed to put on the positive auras yourself, or you risk wasting your entire turn by getting it covered up. Now, negative auras were a recent addition and they're pretty easy to understand, but now we're going to get into a lot of the things that were added in the Rochambeau update, which is very infamous to a lot of players. Let's start with one of the easiest mechanics to understand, clear. Now, whenever you see the text clear in these purple letters, that means you are going to remove something and get something else in return for those things. It's a little unintuitive because there's also a remove text that is not purple that just straight up removes things, but you don't get anything for them in return. And there's also spells that just say steal that allow you to steal something, but it is a little bit different than clear, because clear is often not getting that thing in return. If we look at what this new Fire Elf does, it does the original dot that we talked about earlier. It's a 150 round dot over 3 rounds. And then on top of that, it will clear 2 shields for 90 fire damage over 3 rounds. Now, dots work a little weird where they just get stronger per thing that you clear. So if you clear 2 shields, it won't actually be 90 damage, it'll be 180 damage. A quick editor's note, one of the weirder spells with the clear mechanic is Elephant, and anything that clears a bunch of instances and gives you dots or heals. These spells will end up giving you a second overtime for a heal or a dot once you meet a certain amount. That amount for Elephant is 4 shields, so once you clear 4 shields, you'll actually get 2 dots. I don't know if it's the same for all of the other ones, but just wanted to note that here. If we look at something a little more simple like Ice Wyvern, it will clear 3 blades and then give you that many traps. These effects are very much reliant on each other. If there are no blades, an Ice Wyvern is just a hit. It doesn't give you any extra traps. This is an essential part of the Rochambeau wheel that KingsIsle has made to balance PvP to make certain schools better against other schools. If your school allows you to clear dots, you're going to be better against fire than a school that doesn't do that. Briefly, while recording this, I noticed that there's also a push mechanic where you just shove something over to your opponent, similar to steal. It just moves the thing to somewhere else. It's goofy, it's not on very many spells, but it's here. Now let's get into the fun spells. Gambit. It is removing things that you have willingly cast to get a large benefit. So an example with this Doom Oni here is if I have 4 shields on myself, I can Gambit all 4 of them to get a bigger hit, to do a bunch more damage. Sometimes Gambits look a little different, where they will remove things for just a different benefit, not necessarily more damage. Wraith here Gambits up to 3 blades for weaknesses on my opponent. It's a pretty easy thing to understand. Clears are for dealing with your opponent's stuff, and Gambits are for using your own stuff to an even greater advantage. Now, Balance kind of has 2 of their own little purple texts here. I don't think a single other school has the Echo mechanic. So what Echo does is it gives you a benefit mirroring whatever benefit your opponent put on. So a simple one is this Echo Aura. Nobody really uses this spell, but it's a good example. It is a hit, and then it echoes an aura for a 20% pierce aura. So if your opponent has an aura on, you also get an aura. But interesting thing about Echo is it doesn't actually remove anything an opponent does. One spell that I feel like a lot of people say is really good is Chimera, because it does a ton of damage and then it echoes dots. So if there's a bunch of dots on you, you can get a bunch of dots on your opponent. But this spell has a huge downside of not clearing those dots, and oftentimes schools that can use dots really effectively are going to do more damage than you're going to do with the Chimera. It's a mechanic unique to balance that I find really fun, but also really difficult to judge whether or not they are good. Now, balance kind of has a little secret mechanic where they just have this per text where it is just an effect similar to Echo, where you're going to get an effect, but you're not going to actually remove your opponent's effect that it reacts to. So with this spell, it is a hit, and then you get a chromatic blade and a chromatic weakness that are 60% per heal on your opponent with a maximum of 2. It is a really weird mechanic that doesn't have like an actual name. Balance tends to be the school that does things like this. The only other spell that even remotely comes to mind for me is Gnomes, where it's a hit and then a heal for every heal that you have on yourself for a maximum of 3. Again, it's just this per text. I don't really know how to refer to this ability. Now that we've gone through all of the ridiculous definitions and weird notations of spells, let's bring it back. Let's calm down from the analytical side and let's just talk about some Wiz slang. Basically just a bunch of different things that we as Wiz creators and as players, that we say, but they aren't actually what's said on the card. So let's talk about them. Starting off with a very easy one, we use the term P-serve to refer to pip conserve. It is just shorthand notation for pip conserve. When you spend an odd amount of pips and you don't have any new pips to spend on them, you have a % chance of converting one of those power pips into a new pip as it is consumed. Speaking of new pips, new pip is a word I've said several times and you might not know what that means. Basically, it is just a regular pip. Anything that's not a power pip, that's a new pip. You might hear some creators saying Shad, and that can refer to anything that either uses a shadow pip spell or just referring to the shadow pips in general. Roughly every 5 to 6 rounds, you will get a shadow pip at max level PvP, and people just call them Shads for short. But it can literally refer to any of these spells or the shadow enhanced hits. We just call everything Shad related Shads. Another thing people might say is Bubble War, which basically just means casting these global spells over and over again as our opponents also cast them over and over again to try to win the war and end up with your bubble being the last one standing. Some people have talked about the auras being similar with an aura war, but I don't think that one's quite catching on, but maybe it will in the future. And then one last thing that you probably won't have to worry about as a new player, but might become more relevant as you get popular, as you do things more and more, if you are a creator especially, but even if you're just somebody who queues a lot, you might get sniped or set for. Now, what those things mean is that people are using their knowledge of what you might use as a strategy to change either their deck or their stats to be able to counter you more easily. Let's say I knew for a fact I was going to get a balanced next match because I've been queuing all night, and since you can only queue each person once per day, you see somebody just get out of a match and you've already fought the person that they're going against, you think it's pretty likely that you're going to get them. And since they're a balance wizard, I might remove these balance bubbles, making my deck more consistent because I don't need those bubbles. Now, I personally think this is a very scummy strategy, but it's absolutely something that people use in the arena. If they know they're going to get a myth, they might run more overtime counters or blade counters. If people know they're going to get a life, they might put in a bunch more heal counters. It's just unfortunately kind of part of a system where the queue is very public and you can see who just got out of a match and who's standing in the arena. There used to be a way to queue from your house, but now you have to come to the arena here, and it is not always guaranteed that you're going to find an empty realm. Right now it's 2 in the morning, so there's going to be quite a few empty realms, but basically people use the term sniping to refer to getting you on intentionally, and people use the term setting for changing your deck to appropriately be able to counter your opponent. And that's pretty much all I have for you guys today. My next entry in the How to Get into PvP series is going to be covering the Rochambeau wheel and what schools counter what other schools. If you're watching this in the future, not when it first comes out, I will have those linked in a playlist. If not, look forward to seeing more of this kind of stuff later on, and maybe check out one of my PvP videos to get a feel for the things that I was talking about. Hope you all had a good one. Later, taters.